so much, Jenny, for hosting this month's town hall. And thank you to our ASL interpreter, Gloria, for all of your help, as well as all of our other interpreters that are working today. So thank you all so very much. So it has been a very heavy, difficult past couple of days. I mean, more than a week. And so I just want to make sure that we dive right into the updates that I have for you this month, and I can go right in to answer whatever questions you all may have. So as what was mentioned earlier, what we're going to be discussing today, I'm going to start off with the January 6th committee hearing update. Then we're going to go into Roe v. Wade. I'm going to review some of the landmark gun safety legislation that we were able to pass. And then we'll go on to your questions and answers for this month. So first things first, what happened yesterday with the January 6th committee? You know, it has been, of course, a month since we last reconvened because we do our town halls once a month. But yesterday's testimony in particular in the January 6th committee hearings was absolutely explosive. This was not a pre-planned hearing. It was a hearing that was kind of scheduled immediately due to rapidly developing information. So yesterday, a White House aide by the name of Cassidy Hutchinson, she was one of the main aides to Donald Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, who was actually a former member of Congress that I worked with and served with on the Oversight Committee. She testified in the emergency hearing yesterday, and she presented some of the clearest evidence to date that not only did January 6th happen, but contrary to the testimony and the statements of many members of Congress and the statements of President Trump himself, that they knew that the events of January 6th were happening. They knew in advance that it would be violent. And in fact, there is a very large amount of evidence that they had planned and encouraged that violence to happen in an attempt to seize and to overturn the election and seize the presidency. So one detail in particular was that Donald Trump had actually planned to go to the Capitol with the rioters on January 6th and asked his Secret Service to let his supporters that had AR-15s, guns, and other weapons into the rally with him in order to then, and he also later then sent them out down to the Capitol on that day. And so this is very explosive information because it also starts to really build evidence of intent and evidence that this was not something that was spontaneous or unplanned, but that there actually was a great amount of knowledge that what was going to happen was in fact going to happen up to the very top, including the chief of staff and the president himself. So, takeaways from the overall hearings, we have that Ivanka Trump and other top Trump officials testified that there was no evidence that Trump won the election, again, starting to add to this picture of conscientiousness of guilt, that when they were stating that the election was stolen, privately, they were acknowledging that the truth was that it wasn't, which the reason that this is very important is because what it appears that the January 6th committee is starting to do is really start to lay down the details of criminal charges. And criminal charges require not just something to have happened, but it really requires a very elevated level of acknowledging intent, planning, how much someone knew prior to an event happening. And so really what the hearings are starting to draw out is how high this thing went and how much everybody knew in advance. 5 members of Congress, speaking of knowing in advance, 5 members of Congress asked for pardons from the White House administration, or rather from the Trump administration in the White House. And asking for a pardon is also an acknowledgement of guilt And that is what makes those requests so deeply damning. And those members of Congress that asked for pardons were Representative Brooks, Gates, Biggs, Gomert, Perry, and Green. I have called for their expulsion, but I also believe that there are going to be very serious questions about DOJ activity. One of the questions that I often get is people saying, why hasn't anything happened yet? Is the committee going to do anything about this? And I think it's just clear to communicate to you all the two pieces of this. Right now, the January 6th committee hearings, their job is investigatory. They are pulling together all of the things that we are seeing in those hearings that are being aired online and on television. Their job is to collect all of this information. And then it is the Department of Justice's job, which is the Department of Justice is an administration that works under the president, under the executive branch, but it is we try to keep it as independent as possible. It is up to the Department of Justice. That's where the FBI is. That's where the Attorney General is in charge of. Their job is to actually, if there are going to be any criminal charges or prosecutions that result from that, those prosecutions don't happen in Congress, they happen in court. And that is where the Department of Justice steps in. So the January 6th committee hearings, Congress, we investigate and we share the results of our investigation. And it is up to the Department of Justice to do something about it. And I will say that I very, very much hope and believe that they should, not because I am a Democrat, but because attempting a coup is illegal. And it is only as illegal as much as there are consequences for such behavior. So, we don't say this as Republicans and we don't say this as Democrats. We say this as people who live in this country and who believe that rule of law is important. All of that is to say, moving on, Trump also directly called state election officials and asked them to, quote unquote, find votes, including there being discussions about actively seizing voting machines from certain states. Trump also tried to install a pawn as his attorney general, basically just firing everybody who would not agree to participate in illegal activity until he found someone that was willing to do so. And we became very, very, very close to that happening. So that is the recap on the January 6th hearings. I'm happy to take some of your questions on that during the Q&A. But because so much has been going on, we're just going to move straight into the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade, as well as many other decisions that came out of the Supreme Court in the last couple of days, including the Supreme Court's decision to overturn our concealed carry laws in the state of New York, and their decision on Roe v. Wade. Now, I think I have made myself very clear my view and what's going on here. And it's that while, yes, we must do everything that we can to codify, which means to pass into law, to reinstate via law, Roe v. Wade and a woman and any person that could become pregnant, their right to choose, everybody's right to choose, and everybody's right to privacy, by the way, because what Roe v. Wade established was not just the right to choice, but the right to privacy. And that has implications, as Clarence Thomas mentioned in his opinion, that has implications for marriage equality. It has implications for the right to contraception, and it has implications for interracial marriage as well, I believe. And I think we see that. Not only do I believe that, but Clarence Thomas specifically named several of these precedents that he believes should be overturned. And that is also on the basis, in part, of overturning Roe v. Wade. And so I think that what we see here is a very, very scary moment in our democracy. And I think what I have come out in favor for is really exploring every single tool in our arsenal in order to check the gross overreach and abuse of authority by the Supreme Court of the United States. I mean, there are so many places to go here because of the depth of misconduct and the depth of abuse of power coming out of the Supreme Court of the United States. First and foremost, you have, speaking of January 6th, you have a president that has been impeached twice, who named 3 members of this court, nearly all of whom lied, or as Senators Manchin and Collins, 2 conservative members of the United States Senate, saying that they were actively misled by members of the Supreme Court when they were nominees in order to secure a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. So you have several members of the Supreme Court who misled and lied. And I use the word lie, not just because Roe v. Wade was overturned and they said that it was established precedent, but because during their confirmation hearings, these Supreme Court justices said that Roe v. Wade was settled precedent, that it was accepted as law. And in their opinion, they stated not just, and they did not provide they didn't rely on technicalities. They said that Roe was illegitimate and always has been illegitimate since the date of its ruling. And that dramatic contrast between those 2 statements, I believe, highlights the depth of what Manchin and Collins will call misleading, I will call lying. But also, even beyond that, when we look at what happened just on Monday, the Supreme Court voted to allow teachers and leaders organizing and leading students in Christian prayer and in prayer in schools. And I'm going to say Christian prayer because I do not believe that if this case arose with a Jewish teacher or a Muslim teacher or a teacher of any other faith, I have my suspicions that the Supreme Court would reach the same conclusions. I do believe that there is an absolute religious bias in the court that is very obvious for many who see. And what we saw with Gorsuch, and I believe that Gorsuch, and many, I think, would argue that Gorsuch actively lied in that opinion that he issued in that ruling as well, because he called this prayer a small, quiet prayer. But we know in documents provided by the court itself in the dissenting opinion, there are photographs of this prayer on the 50-yard line of a school, and it is huge. It is not a small, discrete little event. And this is also contributes to environments, and what the Supreme Court is essentially allowing are environments of exclusion and intimidation for people of faiths, of all kinds of faiths. And so, not to mention, I believe, a core violation of the separation of church and state. But what we have here is a rogue court. You have several members who you have several members on the court who very clearly, very obviously misled members of the United States Senate in order to secure a lifetime nomination to the court. You have justices such as Clarence Thomas, whose family is under active investigation by Congress, whose wife was an active participant in the January 6th insurrection activities, and who he himself failed to disclose his family's income from right-wing political organizations for years. And then he used his seat on the Supreme Court in order to prevent critical documents from January 6th that could potentially implicate his wife from reaching investigators in Congress. What we have here is a court that has debased and delegitimized itself. They have delegitimized itself in the lunacy of their rulings, because on Thursday they ruled that that we can violate states' rights in order to preserve constitutional rights. And that was their argument for overturning New York's concealed carry gun laws. And then, so they did that on Thursday. And then on Friday, they ruled that you can violate a person's constitutional right in order to uphold a quote unquote state right. Except the problem with that is that your right to your bodily autonomy is an inalienable right. It does not belong to the state. It does not belong to a church. It does not belong to a politician. It belongs to you. Your inalienable right and the right of the individuals and those inalienable rights of the individual here in the United States triumphs above all. And so I will tell you as your Congresswoman that I believe and will continue to protect and do everything that I can to protect your inalienable right to bodily autonomy, no matter your gender, no matter your background, no matter your identity. And that is what we have been doing. So I have proposed a long suite of actions that I believe that we can take or begin to explore taking right now, both individually, but also as a party. And I would like to tell you all right now that a lot of people say, well, what can I do? A lot of people are telling you to vote. I do believe that you should vote. In this town hall, in my official capacity, I'm not allowed to campaign. I can't tell you who to vote for, but I do think that it's very important to vote in our November elections. But beyond that, what can we do right now? Well, I think you all individually, we can talk about what we can do as a party and then what the power you all have as individuals. I will say on a policy response, we need to be working on repealing the Hyde Amendment in Congress right now. I am proud to say that we have successfully started to take the steps to repeal the Hyde Amendment. And with the Hyde Amendment, repealing the Hyde Amendment will allow the federal government to invest in access to reproductive care in any place that has federal jurisdiction, including places with federal jurisdiction in red states. I have brought up, for example, the prospects of increasing abortion access on federal lands in red states. There are workarounds around this. We can start exploring this now. We can start working on what the scaffolding and the details of this would look like now. And the actual deep investment would be allowed if we repealed the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment has been in place for a very long time, and it basically prohibits the federal government from investing dollars into reproductive justice and care and reproductive health care for especially low-income people in the United States. And so we need to be repealing the Hyde Amendment. I believe that the president must really put on the table entertaining of expansion of the Supreme Court. The last time the Supreme Court was expanded was during the 1800s. The reason we have 9 Supreme Court justices was because at the time there were 9 circuit courts. We have added since then, in the over 100 years since then, we have added 4 more circuit courts. So we now have 13 circuit courts, but still just 9 Supreme Court justices. I believe the President of the United States should be working to expand the court. I believe that he should come out in favor of expanding the court. I believe that he should come out strongly in favor of either amending or abolishing the United States Senate filibuster. Now, before anyone tells me, oh, but Representative Ocasio, we don't have the votes for that. There's no way we can do it. What is the point in trying? What is the point in talking about it? We don't have the Senate votes to do that, so don't even bother. Well, here's why I say that the President of the United States should come out in favor of these positions. It's because why do you think we don't have the votes for it? I believe that when the president or any president, it's not a personal thing, but when the president doesn't state a position, when, a lot of other people don't state positions on certain issues, it's a lot easier to get away with opposing these very critical pro-democracy reforms. And so when the president does not come out and does not really state a declarative position on the filibuster, when he does not state a declarative position on court expansion, he is essentially putting his foot off the gas. And I believe that right now is a pedal to the metal moment. We need to be entertaining and putting everything on the table. And even if there are multiple considerations, we should not be actively ruling out any single option right now when it comes to reestablishing people's bodily autonomy in the United States of America. So I believe that the president should come out in favor, forcefully in favor of expanding the Supreme Court. I believe that the president should forcefully come out in favor of abolishing the Senate filibuster. Those two actions dramatically increase political pressure and makes it much harder to resist. I think that we need a whip count, an active whip count on which senators are in favor of amending or abolishing the filibuster. And we need to have that whip count updated and needs to be up and center, because while we can elect 2 more senators in order to overcome Manchin and Sinema, I will be the one to tell you honestly and directly that we need an actual whip count on and we need to really truly confirm that there actually only are 2 senators that are resisting changes to the filibuster, because we have not heard from everybody yet. And what I don't want is for us to go through all of this work and for someone who has kind of been on the sidelines to come out and try to obstruct that progress again. So I believe that the president should come out forcefully in favor of abolishing the filibuster. I believe that we should be exploring opening clinics on federal lands, particularly if we are able to repeal the Hyde Amendment this year, as well as many, many, many other actions. I personally believe that Clarence Thomas should be impeached beyond a shadow of a doubt. I am astonished that this is a position that is in any way controversial to anyone. The degree and extent of misconduct that Clarence Thomas alone, in addition to several of his colleagues, have participated and engaged in, is foundationally delegitimizing to the Supreme Court. And it is our responsibility, our constitutional duty, to rein them in. So that's my position there. And then we'll move on to our gun reform legislation that was passed. Last time that we all met here, we were reeling from the mass shootings in Buffalo, Uvalde, and California, as well as many, many, many other places across the United States. Last Friday, the same day as the Supreme Court ruling, we actually did pass landmark gun safety legislation. You may not have heard about it because of the catastrophic ruling, but this was something that we were able to accomplish. Now, does it have everything that I wanted and fought for? Absolutely not. But there are very historic gains in this legislation. So here's what it does. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act funds state crisis intervention programs. These are known as red flag laws. It also closes the boyfriend loophole, which is a huge legislative accomplishment. I would say that it is, perhaps the flagship item of this bill. Closing the boyfriend loophole has been something that we have tried to do in the Violence Against Women Act and so many other places, but for many years, and we haven't been able to accomplish it, but we did on Friday. And what this means is that many laws and federal laws, state and federal laws, only prevent a domestic abuser from getting a gun or from meaningfully blocking an abuser from getting a gun, only if they are married to their spouse. And so there are all of these loopholes where if you are in a relationship, if you're dating someone, if you were dating someone and that person began to abuse you, you had much fewer protections, and that person could much more easily get a gun because they weren't married to you. And this is something that was known as the boyfriend loophole, and it was finally closed after years and years and years of work we finally closed the boyfriend loophole last Friday. And this is also one reason that this is important, is that about 73 to 75% of mass shootings have a domestic violence issue in connection leading up to that mass shooting. And so when we talk about mass shootings, we really are talking about men and we're talking about boys. And a lot of times people say, well, specifically, this is about white men because of what we see of mass shootings in schools and in movie theaters. But I think what we're really seeing is that this is a crisis of men and boys of all races and backgrounds because the mass shootings that happen when a mass shooting happens and it's multiple people in one place in a movie theater, that of course gets a lot of news attention. But when it's 12 people who die due to shootings in the Bronx, and it's 12 people who die in 48 hours, or 30 people who die in 30 hours, instead of 12 people who die, in 1 to 2 hours, these are treated very differently. But what we are seeing is that this is really regardless of when you zoom out in set and setting, this is an issue of men and boys, and there's an overwhelming correlation between mass shootings and incidents of domestic violence, and particularly violence against women and LGBT people. And so closing the boyfriend loophole is going to be really important, because one of the best indicators that someone may be on a troubled path to a mass shooting is incidents of domestic violence. And if we can start increasing and recognizing and preventing people that are engaged in domestic violence from getting a gun in the first place, we can potentially save a lot of lives. The Safer Communities Act does crack down on gun trafficking. And for those of us here in the Bronx and in Queens, and we're seeing, all of these guns and all these incidents of shootings happening, those guns are not coming from the state of New York. Those guns are coming from something known as the Iron Pipeline, where very pro-gun states like Georgia, North and South Carolina, Virginia, etc., where you can just show up and get a gun more easily than you can get a beer, or more easily than you can drive a car. People are able to source and really start acquiring a lot of guns. And then what they do is that they start to just hand that off to other people illicitly. And those guns then travel up the Eastern Seaboard, and they get into the Bronx and they get into our streets. And that's why federal gun laws are so critically important to helping solve our issues here in New York City. And so cracking down on gun trafficking is going to be a very important piece to that. It also expands background checks for young people ages 18 to 21 who are attempting to purchase a gun. And it also expands access to certain mental health services in schools. I want to be very clear that I personally believe that we should not be leaning into this idea of mental illness and mass shootings too much, because we shouldn't be stigmatizing people with mental illness. Just because you may be struggling with depression or bipolar disorder or anxiety or schizophrenia, it does not mean that you are going to be or become a mass shooter. In fact, I think that what a lot of people are using as a term for mental health issues are really issues of white supremacy and anti-LGBT and misogynistic ideologies. And I personally believe that when we see with some of these worst shootings, it's less, there are issues of isolation present, but what we're really talking about is right-wing radicalization. And people are very directly citing digital platforms like YouTube and Facebook and crediting what they find on YouTube and Facebook with the way that they choose to act and the fact that they choose to act in such violent ways. And until we actually address that issue, I think we're still going to start seeing some problems from there. But that being said, I still believe in funding access to mental health services in schools. And so I am happy to see that that is in this bill. But I also think it's important to note that we shouldn't stigmatize people with mental illness. You know, if not the majority of people, an overwhelming amount of us will struggle with mental illness at some point in our life. It doesn't mean that it's forever. It could, but I think it's important that we don't stigmatize mental illness. Mental illness is very much like physical illness. Sometimes you get sick, you go to a doctor. Sometimes you can get completely bounced back, or sometimes you just have a condition that you work with throughout your life, like if you have arthritis or anything else. So I just wanted to make sure that I re-emphasize that point there. There are things in this bill that I fought for and that we all fought for that did not make it in. And that is what we're kind of making sure that we keep in mind for another day. I believe that we should be reinstating the ban on assault weapons in the United States. We had a ban on semi-automatic weapons like AR-15s, and it lasted until 2004. And the amount of mass shootings that we had up until that point were very, very, very low. And the moment that ban lifted, we started to see an explosion in mass shootings the way that we see today. So we know that piece is critical and key, and we can't stop fighting until that and several other provisions are able to be passed as well. And we can still protect the Second Amendment in the United States, but that doesn't mean that we can just allow what is happening now to continue. And so that's what we have there. And so from there, we'll just jump right into the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much for your remarks, Congresswoman. As you said, we're now going to move into the question and answer portion of our town hall. As we mentioned before, if you are signed in via Zoom, please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. And when you do, please do mention what neighborhood you're from so that we can prioritize constituents. So to start, lots of people feeling sort of the shock and burden of rising prices in our district, Congresswoman. So Sharon Beth Long from Westchester Square asks, what do you believe that the federal government should do to tame inflation?
So, this is an incredibly critical point. And I'm glad that this question is coming up because there were so many things we had to discuss, and this is a key one as well. So there's a couple of things that we've got going on. I sit on the Financial Services Committee, and what we're seeing here is that the chairman of the Federal Reserve came in, and I questioned him because one thing that is going into increased prices now is the federal chairman, their decision to increase interest rates. And increased interest rates makes a lot of goods across the board even more expensive. And they also make, of course, housing more expensive if you're trying to purchase a home right now as well. So I pushed the Federal Reserve Chairman on interest rates because I believe that he's trying to solve this problem in the wrong way. And so we need to make sure that we continue to apply pressure to the Fed, because what they're doing, when we talk about what is causing your increased prices, you have these basic rules of supply and demand, right? And so if you have demand go up, that can make prices go up. But also, if you have supply decreasing or suppliers changing how they do things, that also can make prices increase. The Fed and many people are trying to act like the reason your prices are going up are for demand reasons. They're saying, we gave you too much money in stimulus checks. That was a mistake. Everybody's wages went up. Everybody can afford this. I'm not kidding you, folks. And that's why prices are going up. However, what we know overwhelmingly is that the evidence is that prices aren't going up because of you at home. They're not going up because you got a stimulus check. They're not going up because your wages are up. And we know that because average wages have not the increase in average wages has not been higher than the average increase in prices. What we know overwhelmingly is that the reason prices are going up are for supply reasons, companies, and more specifically, profiteering. I'll break down the numbers for you because I think it's important for you all to have this information. We've seen that inflation so far this year has been out of control. It's around 8 point something percent, depending on the quarter and the month, but it floats around 8%, 7%, 8%, about 8.3% in inflation. That's a huge increase in prices. What is normal inflation year to year is about 1 to 2%. It floats around 2%. When you incorporate everything that those people say, when you incorporate the supply chain issues, when you incorporate some of the wage increases that people got, labor shortages, supply shortages, etc., what we're looking at is that inflation would be higher, but it should only be around between 3 and 4%, even when you throw the book at those numbers with everything, with stimulus checks, with wage increases, with supply chains. Prices really only should have gone up in a lot of these models by around 3%. What we're seeing is that prices are going up by 8%. So what explains that 5% increase that is not explained by these other issues? And I'll tell you what we think it is. Corporate profiteering. A lot of these companies got unprecedented assistance also during COVID. They are actively saying in their Wall Street earnings calls that they are raising prices because they can. This is an issue of greed. This is an issue of corporate profiteering. So what can we do about it? I think we have a couple of tools at our disposal. We do have difficulties with the Senate, but we need to be leaning on antitrust policy. We need to be breaking up some of these companies. For example, the top 4 meat processors in the United States make up almost the majority of all the meat that you get in stores. So when only 4 companies exist for all of the meat processing, all of the chicken that you get, Purdue and all of these other meat processors, when it's only 4 companies, it's very easy for them to just raise those prices on you. And that pads their pocket and pads their investors' pockets. And so what we really need to do is tackle a lot of this profiteering. And there's a couple of tools that we have in our disposal. Windfall profits tax. This is something that we should be exploring. And what that says is that especially on items like gas, if your profits get like just abusive in their percentage points, then we're going to claw them back and we're going to give them back to people. Because right now, what these companies and what Wall Street is doing is that they're holding every single one of us hostage to just figure out how much we're willing to pay to just live, just to feed ourselves. And they're raising their prices so high just to try to figure out how much they can just shake our pockets. And so we have to make sure that we start entertaining options like a windfall profits tax. We need to be exploring antitrust. We got to break up these companies that are in big ag, these companies that are, responsible for the overwhelming amount of food that we have. Because when we go after the Fed has admitted themselves that their solutions aren't working. Their solutions will not lower the price of gas, and their solutions will not lower the price of groceries. And so we need to go after these companies directly who are engaging in this kind of abuse, because as you know, this is killing all of us. This is killing all of us. And we can't allow this anymore.
Thanks, Congresswoman. So for those just getting here, in the first half, you touched upon court reform in detail, and I think we're now getting some questions about what exactly that would look like. So Denisa Rodriguez from Sunnyside asks, how would the Supreme Court be expanded, and what would the legislative process to make this happen? what would be the legislative process to make this happen?
So I'm glad you're asking this question, because sometimes for a lot of folks, it's a little in the weeds. But I do think it's really important that we all are very informed on the exact steps in making this happen, because sometimes someone will just say, expand it, or just give us 2 votes. And it is very important for us to understand the process through which this happens. So for anyone just tuning in, I am a member of the United States House of Representatives. I am not a senator, and a lot of the action here is really in the Senate. So that's the prelude to what we're talking about. So I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but basically the Supreme Court was expanded. Last time the Supreme Court was expanded was about in the 1800s. That expansion occurred around the time of Lincoln, and we expanded the court to match the amount of circuit courts. So there are at the time, there were 9 circuit courts in the U.S. judiciary. There were 9 circuit courts, and you had 1 Supreme Court justice that represented each of the circuit courts. And so that is why we actually have 9 Supreme Court justices to this day. It's not in the Constitution. The number is not prescribed. It is up to us to pass into law. However, in the 100+ years since that time, we have added circuit courts. We now have 13 circuit courts, but we still just have 9 justices. And so one of the proposed options, I believe that there are several, but one of the proposed options is to rebalance and reinstate that norm where there is 1 Supreme Court justice for every circuit court. That would bring us to 13 Supreme Court justices. Again, to match with the original intent from the last time that we expanded the Supreme Court. 1 court for every circuit court. So that gets us to a number. Now, that's just one proposal. There are several proposals on court expansion. I'm giving you one example. And so that would take us from 9 to pass it into law. So it is a straight law. So if we are able to hold on to the House majority, then that would ideally come out of the House. Then in the Senate, we have the challenge of the filibuster. And that's why there is no changing anything. There is no changing Roe. There is no Green New Deal. There is no immigration reform. There is none of any of this until we're able to tackle the filibuster. The filibuster is a rule in the U.S. Senate that requires basically any non-budgetary legislation where any senator can require any non-budgetary legislation to require 60 votes to pass. And that's been a really big problem, because when you have a Republican Party that really doesn't want Democrats to pass anything, all they need to do, they don't even have to stand. Back in the day, the filibuster was about talking, and you could block the vote until you couldn't stand anymore. But now a person just has to say, I'm going to filibuster this, and the whole legislation gets derailed. And what that implicitly tells us what that implicitly does is that it establishes a rule that we can't pass anything unless we get 60 votes in the Senate, unless you get a 60% majority in a body that is designed to amplify minority rule. Starting to see what the problem here is. So one key thing that we must do is either abolish the filibuster, or, hey, if they want to reform it to a talking filibuster or a standing filibuster, that's a conversation we can have too. But we cannot, we right now, from gas prices, we passed legislation to lower gas prices. Republicans voted against it. It's up against the filibuster. We already passed the House. We did our job, and we passed the law. We passed the bill to codify and reinstate Roe v. Wade into law. It's stuck with the filibuster. And so the same thing with court expansion. If we want to expand the court, We need both to elect two more, the Democratic majority, and there needs to be two more Democrats elected to the United States Senate, and there has to be filibuster reform in order to successfully pursue Supreme Court expansion. And that is why, one reason why, if you care about these issues, voting and expanding a majority would be very critical to ensuring that we expand the Supreme Court. The filibuster itself, while there is technically a rule that would almost require a filibuster to abolish the filibuster, what we have done in the past, both parties have pursued what is known as the nuclear option in the past to get past the judicial filibuster. So it used to be the case that you needed 60 votes to confirm a Supreme Court justice, and also those circuit level, those lower level justices. A nuclear option was by changing the Senate norms to almost de facto make that the change to the filibuster. And that's why Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh were confirmed with 51 votes, or rather they're confirmed with 50 or 51 votes, as opposed to the 60 that Sonia Sotomayor, for example, needed in order to be confirmed.
Thanks, Congresswoman. I think the next question is about student debt. So Sarah Lowry from Astoria asks, will there be any student loan relief soon? I cannot add hundreds of dollars a month to my bills with how out of control all the other costs are at the moment. I graduated in 2013 and owe $1,000 more than I graduated with, despite paying the PAYE, I think that means pay as you earn, rate every month.
So this is exactly why we've been pushing President Biden on student loan forgiveness. So many people, you're not alone. There are so many people who owe more now than they did when they first borrowed against their student loans. This is a generational issue. A lot of people in Congress and a lot of people across the country don't know and don't understand how bad this issue is, because affording college and a higher education was nothing like this in previous generations growing up. And even here in New York and in New York City, our schools, our SUNY and CUNY schools were basically free. They were almost free or very, very extremely low cost. It actually wasn't until these systems started to become racially integrated that we started to see cost of tuition skyrocket as almost I would argue, a secondary way to enforce class and race discrimination by making higher education far more expensive. It's a way of keeping the people out that were originally kept out prior to integration of schools. And so anyways, all that is to say is that, so what's going on? What's the current state of student loans? President Biden, we've been pushing President Biden on student loan forgiveness. There was I will say there was reporting coming out from the Washington Post and several other outlets about a month ago, or perhaps a little over a month ago, that President Biden was going to announce $10,000 in student loan forgiveness. Then what happened was that we had these national crises with the Buffalo and Uvalde shootings, and it just didn't happen. Again, all of this is rumored, but I believe in the credibility of the Post reporting here. And we haven't heard anything since. Now, ever since that $10,000 student loan forgiveness number got leaked, the Biden administration experienced a very large amount of blowback from the NAACP, from progressives like me, and from young people across the country, saying just a flat 10 grand isn't going to do it here, for a lot of reasons. One is that if $10,000 is going to very meaningfully bring down the majority of your debt, it's because you are in one of the most privileged positions to begin with. It means that you have a job and you've been able to pay down your debt down to $10,000, or you didn't have that much debt to begin with. And so the people who are most in need, the people that owe 50, 60, hundreds, over $100,000 in student loan debt, the people who are most in need are getting the least amount of help. And the people who are closest to this not being a problem for them anymore are actually getting a higher percentage of help. And so we have been really pushing back on the Biden administration to try to reconsider this proposal. I'm very encouraged that they seem to be exploring this and doing this. They're not, they don't seem to be saying that they're going to do nothing. And I do believe that the lack of, they haven't come out and done something on it yet, might actually be a good sign. I am hoping that that what this means is that they are taking this reconsideration seriously from the NAACP and several other, groups and organizations, and that they are retinkering to make this better. That is my hope. That's what my advocacy is. I have spoken with the president directly myself on this issue, and I do not believe that he is going to dismiss the issue outright. But I do think that we're really going to need to push, because I am in complete agreement with you. This is a crisis, and it's a crisis where student loan forgiveness also needs to be paired with tuition-free public colleges and universities, because this debt is just going to rise even after we forgive. The debt is going to continue to be a problem until we address interest rates on student loans and until we address the actual cost of a higher education in the United States. So I wish I could give you an even more detailed update, but that we are waiting on the president in order to share any information. But I've shared with you everything that I know so far.
This is the final question. So, Congresswoman, you were in Puerto Rico recently. And so Idali Torres says, I would like to know if you have more information about your visit.
Yes, so I thank you for asking about the visit. I recently went last month on a congressional delegation visit to Puerto Rico regarding the Puerto Rico Status Determination Act. There are many different issues that are confronting the island, and there are a lot of reasons why it's very important that we be engaged on this issue. First and foremost, like many other constituencies, our constituency of our population and our Puerto Rican community in our district and in our upcoming new district is very, very large. And so many of us have family, or we ourselves are directly affected and impacted, including myself, on what is happening on the island. Secondly, in the present legal situation, Puerto Rico does not have a voting member in Congress. They have a non-voting representative, but if any representatives that actually have the right to vote in the United States Congress are acting on this issue, they pretty much can only come from a couple of places: New York, maybe Connecticut at some point. But the fact of the matter is that there are only a couple of Puerto Rican members of Congress that actually can vote and also represent very heavily Puerto Rican populations. And so in the spirit of that, myself and Nidia Velasquez, who represents district just one or two districts down, we went to Puerto Rico last month to address the Puerto Rico Status Determination Act and start to collect and hear from people on the island on what needs to be done in order for us to have a respected democratic process of self-determination. And so right now that bill entertains three different status options: statehood, full statehood, free association, and independence, and figuring out a just process that is actually agreed to by all parties is the critical goal here. Because you or anyone else may have heard in times past that there have been plebiscites or that there have been votes in Puerto Rico regarding status, and that it may have yielded one result or another. but very often they are not respected because their process and the legitimacy of those plebiscites are very questionable. And their legitimacy, they have really deep legitimacy issues. And the reason for that is because there's no actual agreed upon process to go about this. And in Puerto Rico, political parties are not organized by Democrat or Republican. It's very important that people understand that. But they are organized around party. So there's a pro-statehood party, a pro-sovereignty party, etc. And so if what happened in the past is that you have a pro-statehood party running a status election, or a pro-sovereignty party who's running the sovereignty election, or the statehood party running the statehood election, it creates a lot of issues because the way the ballots are designed can be biased. The way that the processes are established can be biased. Education and things like that all get contested. And so right now we are currently in the process under the jurisdiction of the Natural Resources Committee to try to meet and work with people in Puerto Rico on the island on this bill. I'm also actively covering and working and have been also working in legislation. In addition to all of the things that we're working on here for our community, we also do a lot of environmental justice work on the island, particularly around a lot of the federal and local tax evasion that's going on the island, where you see a lot of these Bitcoin and crypto billionaires that are attempting to displace native Puerto Ricans and violate local law. In Puerto Rico, beaches cannot be privately owned. They are all public land, and there's a lot of displacement and abuse and corruption going on. And it requires, I believe, federal oversight while we are still in this process of figuring out this whole status issue as well. So that bill, I believe that we are working on it. I know that there was a push to try to just bring it to the House floor right away. I don't think that we should do that unless we are actually able to incorporate the concerns and the buy-in from people in Puerto Rico from all backgrounds and perspectives.